So today I thought I'd share with you one of the things that I really love doing in my sketchbook, and I'm about to work on with several of my watercolour classes. So I thought I'd share with you today using a printed sheet as a ground for watercolour. So I've got a dictionary under here. I'll just turn it so you can see it. There's a sheet from a dictionary that I've prepared to accept watercolour, and I really quite like using this. It's in my sketchbooks, and I'm actually going to be using it in a series of small paintings. But what I do like to do is I like to be able to see some of the type through the finished painting. So in this one, it's just a sheet from a newspaper, and I've allowed the word buddleia, which is the flower, hope you can see that, to show through more than the rest. So I've carefully kept that showing through. There's a few more in here that I'll show you. There's another one, very loose landscape. On this one I kept most of the type showing through, so that highlighted the Lake District, which is where it was inspired from. But rather than on the first one that I showed you, where I'd covered up with a titanium white ground so that it was partially showing the lettering, on this one I've left it completely showing, and all I've used is a transparent watercolour ground for this. On this, another one, this is one of my favourites. I'm going to use this for a full painting. This is Enthusiasm, so I've kept a lot of the type over on the left hand side, and I really quite like how the watercolour is coming across some of the type, across the text, and then it's working across the page onto just the watercolour paper. So yeah, this is one of my favourites. I really like it. I think it really works well with this one. Let me grab another book and show you another one. This is a book I've got lots of bits with collage in. So on this one I've got a little bit at the bottom, almost to suggest the ground of the forest or the woods and the trees above it. And again here, let's have a look. So here's one that I've got a different text on, so you can just see little hints of the writing just peeping through in places, and I really like to see these little bits showing through. On this one there's only tiny hints of a real lovely metallic typeface, a real old-fashioned feel to that. And what I do is I prepare several pages at once, so that, oh, there's another one in here. So this has just a little bit of text showing through the water at the bottom. But in my sketchbooks I tend to prepare several pages, and I'll do some where I've completely gone over the top with the watercolour ground with the white in it, so allowing little bits of the text just to peek through. Others I'll only have a tiny bit of the white over the top, and I'll leave far more of the text showing. And I'll do lots of pages in my book, and then I can dip backwards and forwards and use the ones that I want to, depending on my mood. So I thought today I'd show you how I prepare them. So I'll move that out of the way. So I start with a piece of watercolour paper or my sketchbook, and onto that I'll stick on a piece of the text paper I'm going to use. So for this one I'm going to use a piece of, it's actually from a dictionary. I bought it secondhand. It was an old dictionary I bought secondhand, and I'm using it for the base for some of my watercolour sketchbook studies. So I'll just grab my piece of paper. Okay, so I'll get a piece of printed paper, an old book page, or this is dictionary, as I say. I do sometimes use other sorts of text paper. And I'm going to apply a acrylic binder all over the back of it, making sure it's all coated completely, especially along the edges. I'm just doing it onto an old piece of card at the moment so that I don't get glue all over the board underneath it. And then I'm going to stick this onto, I'm actually going to stick this onto a loose sheet of Bockingford watercolour paper. I'm going to prepare these ready for my classes for one of their lessons. So I've got lots to do. So I'll just pop that out of the way. I'll grab a piece of Bockingford, just an 1/8 size piece of Bockingford, and then I want to just stick down the dictionary page, making sure that it's all stuck down, and I've smoothed out any air bubbles underneath. And I want to just make sure all of the sides are properly stuck down. Just pop a little bit on that corner. And then I'll leave this to dry completely before I then start adding a ground on the top of it so that it will accept watercolours. If I just paint on this, the watercolours will soak into it a bit like blotting paper. So I need to prepare it with a special ground to make sure that it will accept the watercolours. So I'm going to leave it to dry, and once it's dry, I'll then be able to come back and pop on the watercolour ground. So the sheets have dried now, so all the dictionary pages have dried onto the Bockingford paper. I now want to apply the watercolour ground so that it will accept watercolours once I decide to work on them. The ground I'm going to use is a Daniel Smith. I'm using the transparent ground to start with. Just open that. And what I'm just going to do is paint this ground over all of the sheet, including the Bockingford paper and the dictionary, just so that there isn't any difference in the surface when I come to apply my watercolour. So I'm just gently brushing it across. It has a milky appearance when you apply it, but it dries back to transparent once it's dried. I like to put 2 layers on, so I'll put the first layer on and then I'll leave it to dry, and you have to leave it for 24 hours to dry before, at least 24, I think it says 24 to 72 hours, but I usually leave it a day before over painting. So I'll leave this to dry again overnight, and then tomorrow I'll come back and I'll apply another layer of ground. If I want it to be just the text showing through, just as it is now, as I showed you in the landscape sketch in my sketchbook, I'll only use the transparent ground. However, if I want to tone it down a little bit to make it so that there's a white surface but with a hint of the text showing through, then I'll use the titanium. They do a titanium white ground, and I'll usually mix a little bit together or thin the titanium down with a little bit of water, 10% water, and I'll paint that over the top so that some of the text will show through, but it won't be quite as bold as it is now. And that's what I'm going to do on these. So I've got a whole pile of these to work through. And once I've done all these, I'll leave them to dry, as I say, and then tomorrow I'm going to come back and put another layer of ground on the top with a bit of the titanium white in it as well. So the transparent ground has completely dried now. I've left it for a day so it's properly dried off, and as you can see there's no trace of it. It's completely transparent with the dictionary page and the Bockingford watercolour paper. Now I don't want to have such a contrast of such a creamy background paper against the Bockingford, and I don't want the words to be quite so bold on this. So what I'm going to do now is go over the top of it. I'm still using the Daniel Smith watercolour ground, but this time I'm using titanium white. And I'm going to put a really thin, fine layer over the top. And what it'll do is it'll just knock down the creamy colour of the paper and also push back the lettering a little bit. So you can still see it through, and you will as it dries, but it's not as bold. So I'm just going to work over the whole piece with very light brush strokes, very thin layer across the surface. Now you do get a brush stroke showing through with the watercolour ground. It gives it's a fine surface, a little bit like a watercolour paper, and I quite like that. In fact, I quite like sometimes leaving the brush strokes to be a little bit bolder and more prominent, so that it almost, when the washes are on, gives a feeling of an acrylic or an oil painting where you get the textured marks of under layers showing through. So it's not completely smooth once the ground is put on, and I'm using a little bit of a crisscross action with this top layer so that it's not stripy, and I'm just gently flicking it out. So it takes a bit of patience to do these, because it's had 3 sessions. Started off by sticking on the dictionary page, leaving that to dry, coming back the next day and putting the first layer of the transparent watercolour ground onto the sheet and onto the paper, and left that for a day to dry. Now I've come back and I'm putting another layer over the top of it, and then I'll have to leave it for another day before I can overpaint it with watercolour washes. And just make sure I've got a little bit over all of it, but it's not a thick heavy layer, it's a very thin layer, gently applied. So I hope you found this interesting. I really quite enjoy this. I feel it gives it another feel to my watercolours, a little bit more of a contemporary feel to them. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.